they've also been quite forward-leaning without actually acknowledging they are forward-leaning about it.
The options are essentially stop providing services or do it for free.
The economy is a system that was designed. We can redesign it to get the outcomes we want to see.
Actually, this wasn't inevitable. You had a choice about what you gave your money to, and you chose to keep your promised landlord.
It is quite devastating to see this current government absolutely trash what has been a really good track record with disability.
The complete lack of investment into Te Ao Māori.
What is the top priority for that $15 billion? The government says the top priority for that $15 billion is tax cuts.
But it's not fair that a religious group like Destiny Church stands outside a school. If it was any other protest group, parents would not accept that.
Hello there, good evening, and welcome to this very special US election results episode. I want to welcome Blake and, of course, Professor Robert Patman. How are you two both doing this evening?
Fine, thank you, Paul.
Good, thanks, Paul. How shall we get into it?
Good place to start. First of all, Robert, thank you very much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
How are you feeling about those results?
Well, I was like many people. I was pretty stunned because it was all the polls suggested it was a very, very close race. It was closely contested, but in the end, as we know, President Trump, former President Trump prevailed and won the key battleground states, which would decide the election. And I think, I was surprised to some degree by that, but maybe the polls did not pick up some of the factors that were actually, if you like, putting Mr. Trump in front. For example, it's quite clear that the economy was really crucial for many middle class, or what we would call working class people, who felt that their living standards had deteriorated markedly. And of course, Mr. Trump started all his speeches by asking the audience in question. And these were rallies, so he was often talking to a sympathetic audience. But the important thing is these rallies were televised and went to a wider audience. And he would always start those occasions by asking people if they felt better off now 4 years into a Biden administration than when he left office. And it was quite striking that he repeated that. And I think, of course, he had a very unusual campaign because it was openly racist, it was openly sexist, and it was openly xenophobic. But that didn't seem to prevent him getting his message across that he was the person to improve the economy for people who've been, if you like, bearing the burden of higher grocery bills. We've seen those in New Zealand, of course, and they're linked to the war between Russia and Ukraine. And also, many Americans were appalled at the rising price of gas. So I think those two things meant that many people were looking towards Mr. Trump in that light, that he promised to do something about it, whereas Kamala Harris was in more of a defensive position. She'd been vice president in the administration and probably felt that she had to defend the record of the administration.
Was she at a bit of a disadvantage because of how late she started?
I think she was constrained. I think after Mr. Biden's disastrous debate performance, he arguably should have gone quickly. But I'm not even sure at the end of the day whether, had Biden decided to go early, whether that would have made a lot of difference. I think Kamala Harris ran a very good campaign. She attracted $1 billion in 3 months in funding from big donors. We can talk about that later, because that may be a strength in the short term, but it may be a weakness in the long term. I think she ran a pretty good campaign. But, Mr. Trump had 4 years to think about this and run for it. And while Kamala Harris had a financial advantage, I think there were certain things going for Mr. Trump. He formed a very shrewd alliance with Elon Musk, who owns X, formerly Twitter. And given that Mr. Trump already has his own social media outlet, Truth Social, and then combine that with X, you have a pretty big slice of the social media market right there. And they were, I'm on X, and many people are, and you could see that Mr. Musk was not holding back. It's very pro-Trump, and so I think, in a sense, Mr. Trump once again showed his acute awareness of getting his voice across on social media, and he may have, in retrospect, Kamala Harris may have found herself pushing against a mountain in that sense early on. But I also think she made mistakes, and it's easy to be wise after the event. As I say, I just want to be clear here. I think she was up against it more than many of us appreciated. Secondly, I think she ran a good campaign. She dispatched Mr. Trump in this debate. She clearly won that debate. What was disappointing, however, she didn't quite have the same dominance outside the debate theatre. I felt she could have taken on Mr. Trump a lot more in some of her set speeches. But I think the biggest mistake was, and ironically, she was being interviewed by a sympathetic media outlet, Politico. And the interviewer said to Kamala Harris, would you do anything differently had you been president during the last 4 years? And she said, no, I wouldn't have done. And then she added, I was there always I was present at the key decisions being made. I think that threw her advisors into a state of panic, because the challenge facing her was always difficult, which was to be a loyal team player. After all, she's still technically vice president, but also create a bit of daylight between her and the president. And of course, we can see what really went wrong for her. She did not convince Arab Americans in crucial states like Michigan, which Mr. Trump won, that she had distanced herself from the administration's disastrous policy towards Gaza. And I think that cost her. Mr. Trump actually did a deal. His campaign went to Dearborn, met with Arab Americans, and Mr. Trump agreed a 5-point agreement with representative of the Arab American community in Dearborn, Michigan. And it was along the lines that he would try and deliver peace in Lebanon and Gaza as soon as he came to office. And it's easy from this distance to underestimate how Arab Americans felt about the administration they voted for had contributed to a situation which the ICJ described as plausible genocide. Many family members in Dearborn had lost relatives, and those bombers were provided by the United States. 4/5 of the munitions used in Gaza, now Lebanon, certainly Gaza, I'm not quite sure about Lebanon, but 4/5 of the munitions used in Gaza, which have killed more than 43,000 Palestinians, 70% of whom were women and children, were provided by the United States. There was a lot of anger about the Biden administration. People felt betrayed. Mr. Trump adroitly took advantage of that. Of course, you may say it's a very cynical move, because if anything, Mr. Trump is probably more pro Netanyahu and then Mr. Biden. But nevertheless, I think these were, if we're looking for weaknesses and limitations of the Kamala Harris effort, I think we have to take these into account.
Yeah. Blank, what questions have you got?
So I would just remind people before I start, don't forget to get your questions in for Robert as we're having this conversation. You can leave them below and we'll get to them a bit later. Robert, do you think that Kamala Harris lost, one of the reasons she lost the election was because her Hollywood list was too oversaturated compared to Donald Trump's? Because we had Beyonce, we had Taylor Swift, we had so many others. Do you think that turned a lot of people off?
I'm not sure about that. It's a very good question. I think in America, endorsements count heavily. I mean, one of the things that some pundits said immediately after the outcome was clear that Mr. Trump had won, a key factor was the fact that a well-known person like Elon Musk was in Trump's camp, but also Joe Rogan, who endorsed Trump shortly before the election. I mean, so endorsements do count a lot in the US. And Kamala Harris had some very high-profile endorsements. So I'm not sure it's the endorsements. I think questions must be raised, however. I think questions of gender and race may have played a role. What we know is that Mr. Trump succeeded, and this was a remarkable political comeback. Here was someone who was incited an insurrection on the 6th of January 2021, which killed 9 people. He hasn't yet been held to account for his role in that, although Jack Smith, the attorney, is working on that, although I think he's paused that for a month now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I heard this afternoon that he was winding that down.
Winding that down, right,
being wound
which
down.
is pretty logical in the circumstances, given that the president will not want that to go forward.
Yeah.
Of course, if you have an independent judiciary, that does raise questions, doesn't it? Why should a political decision maker interfere in due process, particularly if they've been involved? But we do know that he had 88 criminal charges altogether, and 34 of them were convictions. He's a felon. So, and so on the face of it, this political comeback defied all the odds. It clearly didn't affect his popularity amongst key sectors. So how did he grow his support, and who were involved? As I said, I think his stress on the economy and the fact that he's a great performer, Mr. Trump, in the sense that he's a performative politician. He wears a baseball cap. He identifies with the average person. But of course, his life has been anything but average. And so, he was born into an extremely wealthy family, and he's not experienced the same life as everybody else. But he has got a knack for communicating and talking their language. And so I think there was a performative identification with Mr. Trump. In many respects, he channels people's anger. A lot of people are really frustrated in the US. Some of them are doing 2 or 3 jobs, and they still are struggling to do the basics, like get enough food on the table, pay for their groceries, meet their bills. And they feel angry. They feel they're not being treated fairly. And I think Mr. Trump, he gives quite emotional speeches, and I think in a sense, he was able to articulate anger that many people felt. I think that was one thing. And so which groups did he reach out to? Well, he successfully won, much more impressively than he did in 2020. He recruited people from the Latino community, from Hispanics, and lots of young men without college degrees. So he really grew his base. We all knew he had a strong base, but the reason I think he won this election is he actually expanded it. And again, it's quite curious, because you would think the Latino community would not be particularly warm towards Mr. Trump, because he's openly said he's going to be deporting lots of illegal migrants, many of whom come from Latin America. So that is a bit of a worry for them. But maybe they thought by supporting Mr. Trump, he may be aware of their support, and that would make it better in the future. I don't know. I don't know what calculations is going on there, but we do know, I think the key point is, despite predictions that his base would be loyal, but he would struggle with building on his base, in fact, he's achieved that. He expanded his political base.
So are you this? Sorry.
I was going to say, I've got a question that's coming that you might be able to answer. I mean, it's directed at you, so hopefully you can answer this one. It's from Artie87 saying, "Hi, Professor. Is it possible that New Zealand could potentially benefit from the 60% tariffs imposed on Chinese exports? Example, increase in supply of goods, therefore cheaper goods."
Well, the interesting thing is, although China is the primary target, we believe, of Mr. Trump's protectionist measures that he's promised people, New Zealand will also be hit. He's in promising a 10% across the board increase in tariffs on imports into the US. Now, this is bad news for New Zealand because the US has displaced Australia as the second biggest export market for New Zealand. After China, the US is our next biggest market for our export products. So, and they're largely agricultural. So I do think, of course, he may not follow through with this pledge, but I think he will, simply because lots of working people voted for him on the basis these tariffs would go up. One of the reasons he promised these tariffs was to signal to American workers he was determined to protect their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And, New Zealand's agricultural products are seen amongst some agricultural workers in the US as a real threat to their livelihood. So, and you can multiply that many times with other countries exporting to the US. So, whether we will benefit from the 60% on China, if tariffs were not applied against New Zealand, I think we might benefit. But China exports different sort of products to what we export to the US. And, China is now competitive in the technological products. It's competitive in manufacturing. So there's a range of things that China exports. And they're and of course, one reason they've both Biden and the Biden administration and the Trump administration are targeting China is because China is becoming the world leader in clean energy products. And they have huge numbers of electric cars to sell. So this is a big blow for China. What sort of signal does that send to Americans about clean energy? America would like to be a leader in clean energy, but do you achieve that leadership by shutting out a competitor? I think tariffs may, for political reasons, be seen as useful in the short term. Economically, though, it's not going to help global trade. And I think many people with memories of protectionism in the past, it's a race to the bottom for most of the trading partners. So I think it may be a short-term measure. I can't see how New Zealand could quickly capitalize on China being penalized in this way. And particularly if New Zealand does get, unless we negotiate an exemption to the tariff.
We've never been able to get a free trade deal with America. What are the chances of being able to negotiate an exemption?
I think that I heard Mr. Peters saying it's business as normal with the Trump administration. And I heard Mr. Luxon say similar, quite optimistic noises. I frankly are skeptical. And the reason I'm skeptical is we've been trying to get a free trade agreement with the United States for decades, going back to the 80s or even earlier. Somebody said 1939 was our first attempt to get a free trade agreement with the US. But certainly efforts intensified in the 90s. And we thought we came close to it with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a way round the problem, which was to entice the United States into a multilateral free trade agreement, of which they would have been the biggest beneficiary, by the way. But they Mr. Trump pulled the United States out of that agreement. And so, in a sense, what's the prospects now? While the United States is a very important market to New Zealand, second only importance to China, I'm afraid it's a bit of a one-way it's not a two-way street in terms of importance. We are about 55th or 56th in terms of America's export markets. So we're relatively small fry for American exporters. There's no pressure in Washington to give us a free trade agreement. And remember, Mr. Trump is a transactional president. That is to say, he's not going to have a free trade agreement with New Zealand for political reasons. He wants to see that America, and this is America First president, he'll want to see any free trade agreement delivers a lot of economic benefits for the United States. Well, we know a free trade agreement would deliver a lot of economic benefits for New Zealand, but would it deliver corresponding benefits to the United States? Probably not. So I'm not.
I think the answer would be to send Christopher Luxon over then to do the negotiations directly, because seeing what he got out of the coalition agreements, where he got next to nothing and his coalition partners got everything, I think he would be the perfect person to negotiate with Trump. Trump would really love somebody like that to talk to.
Well, you might think that, but I couldn't possibly comment.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. Blake, jump on in.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Paul, because I would say that one of the ministers in this coalition that has impressed me with his negotiation skills is Todd McClay. Give credit where credit due. He's managed to negotiate some of the most difficult negotiations that they've been trying to make for years. So if anyone could do this negotiation, it could be Mr. McClay and Mr. Luxon. They could actually have a really decent shot at getting this over the line. And they're not being disrespectful to the Ardern administration, the Hipkins administration. I just really think with their track record in recent months, with trade agreements, that could be a real possibility. I don't know what you think.
I was going to say, Blake, you've got a fair point, but let's look at the agreements that the Luxon Todd McClay combination have achieved. They got an agreement with the UAE, which had been on the go for many years. To their credit, they got it over the line, so let's not take anything away. They've now got a multilateral agreement with the Gulf states, free trade agreement. So I agree, they've got a bit of momentum there, but let's think about other governments that were trying to get free trade agreements with the United States. The Clark government tried very, very hard. They got one with China, but they didn't get one with the United States. Australia did. And I don't think there's been any lack of effort from John Key. He had a special relationship with Barack Obama, and John Key, if anything, had more impressive economic credentials than, certainly in the North American sense, than Mr. Luxon or Todd McClay. So I'm personally skeptical. I think this is a government in Washington which is quite hard-nosed, and it says that, it makes a virtue of this. It doesn't make the days of cutting deals for political reasons for liberal democracies seems to be over. And what we have to take into account here is that the Trump administration has a different vision of how the world should be run from many previous American administrations, and we weren't able to get a free trade agreement with them. So I'm increasingly pessimistic that we will be able to. I hope I'm wrong. It'd be great if we got a free trade agreement with the US, providing there was not a lot of fishhooks in it for us. I think a lot of people would welcome a free trade agreement with the United States, a huge market, providing, of course, it doesn't encroach on our foreign policy autonomy.
So do you think this will lead, now that the dust is settled on the election, Mr. Luxon's visit to the White House won't be too far behind? Or do you reckon?
No, I think both Mr. Peters and Mr. Luxon will be doing their best to try and negotiate an exemption for the tariffs. And they, to their credit, they've been preparing for the prospect of a Trump victory. So I think they have been planning for this. But, we won't be the only country knocking at the door of the White House trying to get countries have been falling over themselves, some of whom don't think much of Mr. Trump, falling over themselves to congratulate him on his victory. More than 70 countries were knocking down the door to say, what a great, brilliant political comeback, Mr. Trump. Well done. Look forward to seeing you at the earliest possible time. So we will be just one of many countries seeking to win favor with the new administration.
I watched a lot of the posts on congratulating Trump, and one of the most awkward one of many for me was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It seemed very warm but very awkward toned at the same time.
Yes, well, Mr. Trudeau was probably aware that Mr. Trump doesn't think very highly of Mr. Trudeau. I think he's been pretty negative about him in public and ridiculed him. And that probably has not done too much for Mr. Trudeau's self-confidence. Of course, politicians have thick skins. Let's not get too dramatic about this. But Mr. Trudeau's also struggling domestically. And Canada is a very different country from the United States. Canadians do not, as a whole, think highly of Mr. Trump. So there was a bit of a joke in 2016. I know this because my wife is Canadian. And she showed me a video in which, when Mr. Trump was promising to, in the campaign in 2016, Mr. Trump made a great pledge of promising to build a border wall, at Mexico's expense. American wouldn't pay for it. Now, putting aside that vision wasn't quite realized, there was a very funny spoof or a YouTube video in which you saw Canadian construction workers frantically building a wall and saying they would pay for it and they would build it along the whole border with the United States. So there's a bit of a relationship between Canada and the US is a bit like the relationship between Australia and New Zealand to some degree. Both New Zealand and Canada feel the guys next door are very friendly, but we don't often appear on their radar. And I think, in a sense, Mr. Trudeau was probably a little bit awkward because he was trying to strike a balance between being friendly and welcoming to the new president and praising his achievement, at the same time not being so friendly that he would attract domestic criticism.
Fine balance.
What else have you got, Paul? Any questions?
Well, I'm kind of curious about AUKUS now.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to know about AUKUS. I've seen a lot of commentary online on spaces like X or Twitter, where New Zealanders are concerned that maybe we should take another look at AUKUS, because the idea of being in a military relationship with somebody like an isolationist with the big red button could be seen as a little bit concerning. We've also got the fact that we're not changing our nuclear-free policy, and Trump is very pro-nuclear in the way that he sees the world. I'm kind of curious what the ramifications of these election results are going to mean on that particular deal, which I know we're still sort of working through, but also on the sort of political spectrum around the Pacific region and how we're going to have to change how we fit in there.
It's a great question. I must say that I think it's going to be much harder for the national-led coalition to implement membership of Pillar 2 of AUKUS. Just for our listeners, AUKUS is a security, it's an enhanced security partnership between three countries, the US, the UK, and Australia. We were not invited to join it because of our non-nuclear commitment. But there is another possibility for joining, which is called Pillar 2 or Part 2, which includes sharing cutting-edge defense technology. And the government was invited to consider joining. I think it was in March 2023 by the Biden administration, and both Labour and subsequently National are weighing it up. They haven't made a decision yet. I think they were waiting on the election. But what's changed is several things. Firstly, Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance, and Vance is very clear on this, Mr. Vance, the vice president, has said that America only really is interested when it comes to alliances and multilateral arrangements. They have to serve American interests. So that means if we joined AUKUS led by the United States, there would be an expectation that we would be responsive to America's America first ambitions, which for many New Zealanders would smack of being the junior partner in the exercise, or even a master-servant relationship. That's one complication. Trump's vision of the world. He doesn't like multilateral arrangements unless they work for America. And whereas we think multilateralism is great because it extends our influence, it gives us a voice at the table. Another big concern is that Mr. Trump is a climate denier. Now, why does that matter? Because many of our Pacific neighbors, and let's be quite clear, the Pacific nations, the Pacific Island nations are, if you like, a key feature of our foreign policy. 60% of our development assistance goes to the Pacific Island nations. Their number one national security concern is climate change, with sea levels physically threatening countries like the Maldives and also Tuvalu within possibly the next 2 decades or 3 decades. So now how does that affect New Zealand's attitude towards AUKUS? I think we would be getting the message from Pacific Island nations pretty rapidly that if we were to join AUKUS and participate in such an arrangement, we could actually strain relations with Pacific Island nations. And I think they will not back down. A former leader at Tuvalu said to me, there's a great misperception going on in both China and the US. They both think we, Pacific Island nations, are pawns in a great strategic game. And of course, AUKUS is based on the assumption that China is the number one threat to an international rules-based order. But the Pacific Island nations don't see it that way. They believe their number one threat is climate change. And therefore, they're not going to buy the US-China rivalry paradigm. They're not going to allow themselves, if they can, not to be dragged into one side or the other. Because if you think about it, for smaller countries, when you've got big players scrambling and seeking to try and win favor and influence, you don't align with one against the other because that diminishes your leverage. You play one against the other. So I think that New Zealand will not be unresponsive to the views of the Pacific Island nations. I think Mr. Trump's leadership, the fact that he's a climate denier, will not actually help. It will not make it smoother for us to get into AUKUS. And here's a great irony. Had Kamala Harris won the election, we probably would have felt much more comfortable proceeding with going into Pillar 2. And it's not just New Zealand that's feeling uncomfortable about a Trump leadership. I was in Australia last year, September last year, and over a year ago now, but I was really struck how worried Australian officials were about the ramifications if Trump became president. Could AUKUS survive? In other words, will Australia remain in AUKUS? They're paying for it, by the way, close to $400 billion. It's one thing to pay for something and it's benefiting the UK and the US. It's quite another thing when suddenly you're paying for it and the person enjoying the benefits also expects to call the shots as well. And I think there's growing skepticism in Australia about this arrangement. So I think, to answer your question, Paul, I do think the Trump administration has seriously made it more difficult for the national-led coalition to sell to the British the New Zealand people, the prospect of joining Pillar 2.
So a follow-up question that's actually come in about that here as well. Again, from Artie Farty wanting to know in relation to that, whether or not the Pacific Island Forum could team up with something like CARICOM when it comes to environmental issues, power of numbers type of thing. How effective would that be in the long term, which came through in the very next message? Just didn't quite fit in this one.
Right. It's a very good question. I don't think we should underestimate the agency of the Pacific Island Forum or the nations that make it up. One thing that concerned me for some time is that sometimes New Zealand and Australia make decisions about their foreign policy. In this country, we always say that the Pacific Island nations are vital to us. We have people-to-people links, cultural links, and we give the bulk of our development assistance there. But did we fully consult with the Pacific Island nations before we went into discussions with the Americans about joining Pillar 2? So we can't take this as a one-way street, that the Pacific Island nations would just agree what we want. They are absolutely determined to address this problem of climate change. And the Biden administration was good news for the Pacific Island nations. In fact, Kamala Harris played a key role in that initiative. It shouldn't be forgotten that between 2021 and 2023, the US delivered something like $800 million in assistance for development and also technology designed to ameliorate consequences of climate change. It wasn't, also President Biden hosted the Pacific Island leaders in the White House and began a process of having an annual conference with them. So this was seen as considerable progress. I don't think the Pacific Island nations, they can't. Their physical existence is threatened by climate change. I think, to answer your question, the question that's been asked, which is an excellent one, my crystal ball is no better than the others. But if they're not supported, if they perceive they're not getting enough support from what they regard as their traditional friends, Australia, New Zealand, I think they will be turning and looking at alternative avenues.
Cool. And I got another one here that's popped up, wanting to know what your thoughts are on the likelihood of Trump attempting to dismantle the education and media within the US, the risks from RFK appointing health officials, and what you think Elon might be appointed to.
Well, I think to ask the last question first, I think Elon Musk's job, he's going to be the cost-cutting person. As the jurisdiction he's going to have, he's going to be responsible for cutting public expenditure or unnecessary public expenditure. The other questions about, I think in that document called Project 2025, prepared by the Heritage Foundation, which Mr. Trump distanced himself from during the campaign, but in fact many of the key people who worked with him in the past contributed to that document, so it has to be taken quite seriously. Yes, they're going to shut down the education department in the United States, and also it was very interesting to me, if you watched Mr. Trump's victory speech, he complimented J.D. Vance for willingness to go and speak to what he called the enemy networks, which he meant here CNN, MNBC, etc., etc. It's a bit concerning when a president talks about mainstream media outlets as enemy networks. So I do think we don't, obviously it's a good question, we don't know exactly how this is going to pan out. I do think that Mr. Bannon has a team around him who are determined to transform the American state. Remember, their project is to eliminate what they call the deep state, and also to get rid of public servants who are independent. They want public servants to be pro-Trump. This is a huge change. And also, Mr. Trump regularly described the mainstream media as the fake media. And he also described it as enemy of the people. He also threatened media networks if they didn't, as he put it, more accurately report the news, they might not get their licenses renewed if he became president. So it's a bit of a, these are good questions. I do think we don't know how he's going to do it. I do think the intention amongst the likes of Vance and Bannon, Steve Bannon, is going to be a key player in this administration. He was released from prison just before the election. He's a real ideologue. He has a vision of America. This is going to be quite a right-wing administration. We don't know exactly how they're going to achieve this, and it could cause chaos and confusion. Here we have a number one superpower who's got some of the best educational institutions in the world. I recently saw Mr. Musk basically being critical of some of the elite institutions such as Harvard and Yale in the US. So there could be some big radical changes coming. The other question raised about RFK Jr. He's apparently going to be, and correct me if I'm wrong because things are moving quickly, but I think he was going to be given responsibility for health, and it could involve taking the fluoride out of tap water, and it could also involve a reduction of the vaccine program in the United States.
So, from what I've heard, he wants to cut vaccines altogether.
Cut vaccines altogether.
Yeah.
Well,
this is the man who was responsible for 83 deaths in Samoa from a measles outbreak. It doesn't surprise me he's against any kind of vaccine.
Yeah. So these are very radical measures, and it could cause turmoil and convulsions in Washington. There's a lot of formidable experts in the United States who are not simply going to roll over and say, oh, yes, you can get rid of vaccines if they're convinced it's going to imperil large parts of the American population. So it's going to be interesting, but I do think the intention is there. I think Mr. Trump has reflected on his first 4 years, and although he sacked people a lot, he has said he was very frustrated by the fact that members of his cabinet sometimes were not on the same page as him. And I think if you decode that, it basically doesn't want too many independent people. He did say in his new administration, the key yardstick for appointment, or the key benchmark, would not be their ability, would be their loyalty. So we could see some rather poorly qualified people being appointed to very high profile positions. That hasn't happened so far. I thought the appointment of his chief of staff, by the way, Susie Wiles, made a lot of sense because she must take some credit for managing what had turned out to be a very shrewd campaign.
I did have to laugh. We had an episode of this last night where we do a news thing, like a weekly news roundup. And the first one was actually mentioning Susie Wiles, and the joke, because it's all supposed to have a comedy slant, was the number of conspiracy theorists here who got angry because he chose a microbiologist from New Zealand that worked with Jacinda. But that came because I caught half a dozen comments on Twitter from New Zealand residents going, I can't believe that that's the woman that he's putting in charge. Like it's this really weird sort of disconnect where they go, well, you've got Susie Wiles, the microbiologist that we saw a lot of during COVID, and you've got Susie Wiles who's been working behind the scenes with Trump, and they got them mixed up.
They got them mixed up. Yeah.
Depressing to see. Very depressing.
Do you think we'll see Harris back in 2028?
I think it's too early to say, Blake. I do think the Democrats have to go back to the drawing board as a party. I said to you something early on in the discussion this evening that Kamala Harris was able to raise a fantastic amount of money, a record amount of money, $1 billion in 3 months. She was awash with campaign funds, but they were from all very wealthy donors. And there is a number of people in the Democratic Party who believe that the Democrats need not to be reliant on big money donors who dictate the political agenda. There was an example of this, by the way, simply after Kamala Harris took over. She started after she was nominated. I say took over. She was nominated as the successor, as the Democratic nominee for president. It was the 21st of July. Shortly after, she began quite an effective campaign against price gouging, which of course would appeal to many Americans, because many Americans believe that powerful corporations have fully taken advantage of inflation to slap prices up. And she started a campaign against price gouging, but it was suddenly stopped because one of her very powerful donors indicated they were very unhappy. So that has raised questions about, does the Democratic Party actually need to rethink its dependence on big money donors, because they have their own political agendas. And unfortunately, one of the reasons so many members of the middle class, or working class we would call them, but in America often referring to the middle class, switch their allegiance to Trump is because they've given up on the Democrats. Because they see the Democrats as dominated by billionaires. And of course, Mr. Trump's government will be a government of billionaires, but there is a sense, at least Mr. Trump was talking their language to some degree. He was offering them more hope in their eyes than the Democrats. So I do think the Democrats got to do some soul searching here. There's another question of who should be their leader going forward. I thought Kamala Harris made mistakes, but she had a tight time frame. I think she showed some real promise. I thought her debate performance was excellent. But I think she could have been more effective on the stump, so to speak. But it's easy to be critical. I think she's got promise, but there are, this is not a party short of talent. The other question I think the Democrats have got to grapple with is a question that Bernie Sanders and also AOC, other progressives within the Democrats, keep raising. Should they aim to take private money out of American politics? That is to say, should it be publicly funded elections? Because at the moment, lobbyists dominate US politics. It seems far-fetched at the moment.
Much like here.
It seems far-fetched and seems impossible. But if a major party took a stand on this issue, change might come. And it might also swell support for the Democrats amongst what they see as their traditional constituency, working people. So these sort of issues have to be grappled with. And I do think after a defeat like this, they're going to have to actually redefine themselves to some degree. And the question of who becomes leader, I think it's too early to say.
My final question then is, do you think that if they have to rebuild, even though it's a bit early to say, they may have to look at someone like a Michelle Obama, or maybe an outsider, maybe a Democratic celebrity, perhaps?
George Clinton for president.
I'm not sure. I think they need to have someone who's got street credibility amongst ordinary people. I think, I don't think, one of the things I found very interesting is that some of the major networks, which are Democratic leaning, have criticized Kamala Harris for being too progressive during the election. I don't think that's true, because if that was true, the Democrats would have held on to, if you like, the support of working people. But what is remarkable about Trump is he has actually rebuilt the Republican Party, and he's got a new Republican Party which appeals to working class young Americans, particularly males. And that must be of concern to Democrats. I'm not sure going back to reach to the past, Michelle Obama or other leaders of the past, is the way forward. I think they've got a number of very talented young people in the party, and it may be time for them not only to rethink their philosophy as a party, but also open up the possibility that there's a lot of talent in the party, and maybe it's time to give it more opportunity. I was struck by the fact so much of the Democratic establishment have been harshly critical of AOC and Bernie Sanders. And yet, Joe Rogan said recently, if Bernie Sanders had been the Democratic contender, he's an independent, of course, but he's aligned to the Democrats, he would have voted for him. And, Sanders came very close to getting the nomination in 2016. So he's clearly, his age is against him. So I think you have, but there are people who've come into politics because of Sanders, like AOC, who must have a big political future. The job for the Democrats, I think, is to try to look what is in the interests of the party, but not in the interests of their big money donors. What do they, who are they trying to inspire and win support? If they're going to try to win elections, they need to maximize their support. And that may mean looking beyond big money donors.
All right, one last question for you, and this might be a really difficult one to answer. What is history going to remember about the events of the last 6 months?
You mean with regard to the contest between the Republicans and the Democrats, or?
Yeah, and the outcome.
I think actually the outcome, I think what's significant but often missed is that Mr. Trump is not an aberration. That is to say, he is a product of the way America is in the post 9/11 world. 9/11 was a traumatic experience for the United States. And if you look at the United States in the post 9/11 period, it's experienced a number of disquieting trends. It got engaged in an illegal and disastrous war in Iraq, which caused tremendous divisions in the United States. It experienced a global financial crisis, and not just America, but the rest of the world. Why? It tried to fight 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq on the credit card, didn't work. And that global financial crisis meant that close to a quarter of the American population lost their homes. So America was deeply affected by that financial crisis. Then, of course, there was the rise of Islamophobia. Then there was the birther controversy about whether President Barack Obama was really American, which was orchestrated by our friend Donald Trump. I think all these trends coalesced.
And sorry about the noise. It sounds like I'm in America with the fireworks going off out there.
No worries. One other thing I'd like to say is that we shouldn't forget about it. Another thing that has divided Americans in the post 9/11 period, we've had the rise of China, the sense that America is not just a lonely superpower. We have 2 superpowers now. And Mr. Trump kept referring to this in his campaign successfully, America has declined relatively. So America's experienced relative. I think, in a sense, the reason that Mr. Trump was able to strike a chord with audiences in both 2016 and 2024 is because he articulates the anger and the frustrations of many Americans who face a mounting level of grievance in their lives. And I think, in a sense, Mr. Trump is a product of the post 9/11 environment, and he has thrived in a society where there's much more division, and he's let's be quite clear, he's contributed to it. But I think, that strikes me as the thing that is really important, and the fact that the reason I want to I don't wish to labor it, but the reason I think it's important is that Mr. Trump is not a one-off. There's plenty of people who agree with him, and it's not just in America. So we've got the rise of populism. We're for liberal democracies. The election of Trump is a challenging moment because, particularly for a country like New Zealand, which believes in international institutions, Mr. Trump doesn't. Not really. He's undermined the WTO, a crucial institution for New Zealand. We're a free trader. Mr. Trump's a protectionist. So we've got some big challenges ahead. I think the government will find a way of having a good relationship with the US under Trump. But my own view is one of the lessons that I think New Zealand governments should take, and we should agree where we can with Mr. Trump, but we should not hold back or remain silent when Mr. Trump takes steps that undermine the New Zealand national interest.
I think that's a really good place to finish. Anything you want to add before we go head off, or I let everybody know the poll results?
Oh, just thank you for coming as always, Robert. It's lovely
Thank
to
you.
see you, and your knowledge is much appreciated.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome. Always
feel smarter after chatting to you, Robert. It's
Thank
all
you.
really, really dumb because I thought I was smarter. It's one of the two.
No, if it's any consolation, Paul, a professor said to me many years ago when I was an undergraduate at university, remember, Patman, there's no degrees of expertise about politics and international relations. There's only degrees of ignorance. And I wonder what he was talking about. But, you know, we live in such a fast-moving world. It's very important. We've all got to be a bit humble about events because they're moving so quickly and there's so much information out there. So I think, it's constantly being surprised by events.
It'd be boring if we weren't, though. If we weren't being surprised. So we've been running a poll tonight asking people which of the potential Trump appointees were their biggest concern. Elon Musk, RFK Jr., JD Vance, or Hulk Hogan, who apparently is being offered a role around nutrition in RFK's new health department. Who got no votes? Hulk Hogan got no votes. 24% are concerned about RFK, 31% about JD Vance, and 45% about Elon Musk being involved in that particular cabinet, which is, I think, understandable. Very concerning. Very, very concerning. Yeah, right, I'm going to wrap it up there. Sit tight for a second, Robert, and we'll get all the uploady stuff done. Everybody else, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'll have the audio version of this available at some point, probably tomorrow, I think. Until next time, have a fantastic week, and we guys will catch you all later.
Bye.